Hey guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with the Poetrytube Newbie Tag. This was an original tag from Strip Cover Lit, and I was specifically tagged by Adrian over on their channel. I've been meaning to do this for a minute, but I was sort of trying to decide how to do this tag because I don't read much poetry, but I would like to. One of my goals for this year is to read a little more poetry and start getting into the genre some more because I honestly haven't read enough poetry to know if I like it or if I don't. The only poetry I've read in recent years was Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur and The Princess Saves Herself in this one by Amanda Lovelace, neither of which I enjoyed, but they're both a very specific type of poetry. They both have a very similar style, so I just definitely need to branch out and try new styles and hopefully find something that I like. So as such, I've changed some of the questions on this tag because I did want to have like actual things to say for most of these, but I will include all the questions and the link to Adrian's original video down below. The first question is, do you read and write poetry or do you just read it? And like I said, I don't read much poetry. I have read some, especially for class. I took a lot of English classes. I was an English major, so particularly for school, I read a number of poets, but I don't read much, and I would say I don't write it either. I've used sort of free-form verse poetry to sort of journal at points in my life, especially when I was a teenager or in college a bit. I don't do that much, and it was never like poetry, it was more just a way to journal that was much shorter and more succinct. But I would say largely I just read it, I don't write. Question 2 is, who's your favorite poet? Again, I don't feel like I've read enough poetry or enough of any particular poet to claim a favorite, so I decided instead to talk about some poets I specifically want to read. The first being Emily Dickinson, just because she's Emily Dickinson, she's who you read when you read poetry. She's kind of one of the greats and who you start with. So I have read a couple of her poems. I was an English major in college, so obviously we've read some Emily Dickinson, but nothing that stood out to me, and I'd like to read some more of her work, whether or not I like it, just to have read it and sort of start getting into the genre. Lang Leave is also on my list. I know she's a particular favorite of Rainy over at Rainy Veronica Tan, and she's recommended her to me, so I do want to try her out at some point. And also Lucy Greeley, because I read Lucy Greeley's memoir, which was Autobiography of a Face. I read it about 2 years ago, and I really enjoyed that. I thought her prose was written beautifully. So I'd like to read some of her poetry to see if I enjoy that just as much. Question 3 is, what is one question you would ask your favorite poet? So since I don't really have a favorite, a question I would ask any poet is, why poetry over prose? Like, what speaks to you in poetry that doesn't in prose? Because for me, as a reader and as a writer, I don't tend to understand poetry as well as I understand prose. I can read prose, even prose that is literary fiction or classics. It's very difficult to understand, and it has a lot of meaning to me. But when I read poetry, it's more like looking at a piece of visual art where I just don't understand it. For whatever reason, my brain doesn't work in a way that it has a lot of meaning to me. It's pretty, but it doesn't have a whole lot more. So I'd really like to hear from poets or poetry readers about the difference between the two for them. That would be interesting, as someone who hasn't read a lot of poetry and hasn't read a lot of it because they don't fully understand it. Question 4 is favorite poem, and for me, that's really easy. It's a very generic answer, but that is The Tiger by William Blake. I read a fair bit of William Blake, actually, and he's probably the closest that comes to a favorite author, but I haven't read enough that I feel comfortable saying that about him. But I absolutely adore The Tiger, and I know it's in every cop show and every crappy psychological thriller movie, but it's such a beautiful poem. Like, at one point, I had the whole thing memorized. It was just one of those poems that was really beautiful to, like, know the whole thing. Not just the famous verse, but every verse. And I absolutely love that poem. It's probably the only poem I've ever read that I actually have really loved. So question 5 is, what is your favorite poem to read aloud? And I'd have to say The Tiger again, because that is overall the only favorite poem I have, and I haven't read enough to say, like, reading aloud versus reading to myself. Question 6 is, who's on your Mount Rushmore of poetry? And this is kind of a stretch because, again, I have not read that many, but William Blake obviously would be the first one. Shakespeare, because I absolutely adore Shakespeare, although I have read many more of his plays than I have his sonnets. I was never all that into his sonnets, but I have taken 4 Shakespeare classes between high school and college, so I have read a great deal of Shakespeare, and enough that I feel comfortable putting him on this list. The third is William Carlos Williams. He's not a particular favorite of mine, but I do like the poems of his that I have read because on the surface they're so painfully simplistic, but they have so much meaning and pack such a great impact that it's really interesting to read and really interesting to unpack them. And I thoroughly enjoy his poetry, what little of it that I have read. And then fourth, I really struggled for a fourth to think of someone who I've read at least several poems by because I didn't feel comfortable putting someone on here that I'd only read like one poem by for a class in college. So I had to go with Shel Silverstein just because in my life, the poet I've probably read the most is Shel Silverstein because that was probably the time I was most interested in poetry, particularly children's poetry. And I think he does a great job at writing poems for children. Question 7 is what is your favorite poetry collection? I don't have one, so I do have a poetry collection that I plan to read. It is The Wick of Memory by Dave Smith, collected poems from 1970 to 2000. I've never heard of Dave Smith. I picked this up from a friend a while ago, and I believe she had this for a class in college. It's the only one I own that isn't like an academic collection of poetry like a Norton anthology, so this is the one I'm talking about. I want to read it this year at some point. It's going to be one of my poetry books, so I'm very interested to see what I think about it because I have no idea what kind of poetry this is or who Dave Smith is. Question 8 is rhyming. Talk about it. Yes, no, not anymore. I think yes, but with the caveat that rhyming is really hard to do and not sound childish. Like Shel Silverstein obviously does it very well, but he's trying to sound childish. It's supposed to be for a child. And I think classic poetry often does it without sounding childish, like William Blake with The Tiger. But I think it's difficult in modern poetry to do it without just sounding sing-songy. I think it can be done, and I think it can be done very well, but it is one of those that is a little bit difficult. So I'd be hesitant of modern poetry that has a lot of rhyming, but I wouldn't be automatically averse to the idea. Question 9 is, barring free verse, what is your favorite poetic form? And this is the only question on this list that I can't even pretend to have an answer for. I don't know anything about poetic form. And that's one of the things, I just want to try a lot of different kinds of poetry, different poetic forms, different genres, different authors, different time periods. Like, I just want to try a lot and see what I like, if anything. So if you have any recommendations for me of different poetic forms or different poets down below, feel free to leave them because I'm just getting into the genre and I really don't have much of an idea of where to start other than just like the people I've heard of. So I'm always down for some more recommendations. Question 10 is humor in poetry or no? And I will say in theory, sure. For me personally, no, I don't get humor in writing a lot. At least in prose, I don't understand humor in writing. It often goes over my head and I don't find it funny. I can understand the point they're making. I don't like a lot of satire for that reason because I'll understand what's being satirized. It just won't be humorous. To me, it lacks that enjoyment factor reading it. So I would probably stay away from humor in poetry apart from like Shel Silverstein because I feel like he's the one exception to that rule, for me at least. The 11th and final question is, what elements do you think contribute to the best poetry? And I haven't read much poetry, but I do like poetry that has either characters or people or it's about the poet. Because one of the things I care about the most in prose is the characters. So carrying that over to poetry, whenever there's people involved in the poetry, whenever it's about relationships, any kind of relationships between people, not just romantic, but any kind of platonic or familial relationships as well, I do think that would probably speak to me a lot. And I also think poetry that's about social issues, I think that's one of the reasons I do like William Blake, because he wrote about a lot of social issues of the time. I think that's something that might interest me a lot. But like I said, I'm just trying to get into the genre and try new things, and I think that might be a good place for me to start, but we'll see what I actually wind up enjoying. So this has been fun for me to do, sort of like talk about my personal introduction to poetry and kind of what I plan to read. My specific goal was to read 3 poetry books this year. That's just sort of like an idea that I'd like to get into the genre. And if I don't wind up reading 3 books, but I wind up reading a number of individual poems, I'd be happy with that as well. But I do really want to try out poetry and see what I like within it. Because I haven't found much that I've loved so far, but I do feel like I love prose so much, there's got to be some poetry that speaks to me as well. I just have to find it, and hopefully I will find some of it this year. I'm going to tag Madman Reads and Rocks, Rainy Veronica Tan, and Charlie Brooke because I know they all read poetry. But if you read poetry, I would love to see you do this tag as well because it's really interesting to hear people talk about their favorite poems and their favorite poets and what they like in poetry because it's given me a lot more ideas for what to start with. As always, thank you guys so much for watching and I'll see y'all again soon.